Hi, I'm Scott Castline, and I am so excited to be working with Wool Life to install loose fill sheep's wool insulation in our Ram ProMaster camper van. So first I want to talk about framing. The way we did our framing is so that our vertical studs are the furthest thing out from the wall of the van. So no metal bit is going to stick out further. We're not going to have to build around anything when we go to put up our walls. So you'll see, you know, this is one of the bigger pieces of metal here, and this slides perfectly along our studs. What we're going to do is when we go to install the insulation is we're just going to be stapling up a mesh material over the front of these studs, and we're going to be blowing in all of the insulation behind that. We'll cut little holes, put a tube in there, and it'll just fill it all up. One of the advantages of loose fill insulation is that it is able to fill any size gap. You can put it in the nooks and crannies. You can fill a 4-inch gap, you can fill a 2-inch gap. So whatever you're working with in your van, when you have your windows and your framing up, it can work with any of those spaces, including the doors, just anything. So it's a really nice, easy product to work with. You don't have to worry about it being too thick and compressing it and reducing its R value. You also don't have to worry about having 2 inches of batt insulation with a 3-inch gap and wasting that space. So this way you're able to utilize every bit of space that's behind your walls. So for our floor, we actually use the same wood beams as our framing, and we use Sikaflex to glue them down to the floor instead of using self-tapping screws. And what we're going to do is we're going to staple the same mesh down on top of these, and we'll have about 1 inch of loose fill insulation on the floor. And on the ceiling, we didn't want to lose too much headroom, so we are going to have about 1 inch of insulation on the ceiling. And instead of staples, we're actually going to be using liquid nails to adhere the mesh to these cross beams, these channels up on the roof here. So here, Gabriel and Maritza are cutting the material. Remember, you can cut it too big and trim it off, or you can always use small pieces as patchwork. Here, Gabriel is explaining how important it is to keep your material taut. And by using a triangle to anchor your points, it'll eliminate any possible sags or wavy areas in the material. They're using 1/2-inch metal self-tapping screws to mount the mesh. You just build one triangle and then add another point to make another triangle, and so on, checking as you go. One thing that we've learned throughout this process is just how important it is to get the mesh right. This honestly is where most of the time was spent and makes the rest of the process much easier. You can always cut around certain features in your van that you want to be able to access in the future for electrical wiring, around your lights, and so on. We chose to put insulation above our cab, so you can just pop the tabs out and reinsert them later. On our walls, since we have wood, Gabriel is using a hammer stapler to attach the mesh to the walls. Again, working in a triangular pattern to keep everything nice and taut. And you can cut out any material in areas where you just don't need insulation. Don't be afraid to use a lot of staples to keep everything in place. Here, Gabriel is explaining again the importance of using a triangular pattern to build from. A hammer stapler makes life a lot easier. As you can see, you can put a lot of staples in very quickly, and it doesn't tire you nearly as fast as a traditional stapler. And you can just trim off any excess mesh that isn't needed. At this stage in our van build, we hadn't installed our electrical wiring yet, so I told Gabriel to leave certain channels in the van open so that we could put our wiring in at a later date and install the rest of the insulation on our own. In this particular area, we are building a recessed box in the wall where our bed will be so that we have a couple more inches of headroom. So he's just cutting the mesh material around that box. Always check for wires in areas where you're going to be drilling so that you don't accidentally pinch or screw into a wire, a cable, or any other mechanical part of your van. You can use many different things to install the mesh itself. A lot of people have leaf blowers, so you can actually use the intake of your leaf blower to insert the wool and attach a vacuum hose or some other type of hose to the blowing end of the leaf blower, and that's how you install the wool. Don't feed too much wool in at one time or it will get clogged. Here you can see how nicely the loose fill insulation fills all of the various gaps in your van. If things get messy, you can use the vacuum part of the leaf blower to just suck up any loose fill insulation that falls on the floor. Sheep's wool is environmentally friendly and biodegradable, so it's really not a big deal if it ends up on the ground or even in your garden. It's full of nitrogen, so it actually might help. It's important not to overfill any of your cavities. You want it to be full, but not compressed. Now they're onto the floor. Again, don't be afraid to use lots of staples. you find an area that didn't completely fill, just cut another hole and use your hands to stuff more in. As you can see, this process is pretty straightforward, and we couldn't be happier to have loose fill sheep's wool insulation by Wool Life in our camper van.